course. Aye, my lord. Right.
Our allies'
Right.
hero has
Aye,
fallen.
my lord.
More
Our
words?
allies'
Yes, my
hero
liege.
has fallen.
On my way. What do you need? Of course. Of course. Right.
Our allies' hero has fallen. Our allies' hero has fallen. Our allies' hero has fallen. Our allies' hero has fallen.
Say the word. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Of course. On my way. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Right. Right. Of course. Say the word. Aye, my lord. On my way. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Orders. Let me at 'em. Right. On my way.
Our
Of
allies'
course.
hero has fallen.
What do you need? Right. Aye, my lord. Attack! Orders. Right. Aye, my lord. To arms! Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Say the word. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders? Right. What do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Let me out. What do you need? Say the word. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. Yes, my liege. On my way. Right.
What is it?
Say the word. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Attack! Yes, my liege. Let me out. Orders? What do you need? Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. On my way. Orders? Right. Yes, my liege. Right. What do you need? Attack! Say the word. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Orders? Right. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Say the word. Of course. On my way. Say the word. Of course. Aye. Right. Yes, my On my way. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Of course. Dwarves! On my way. Aye, my lord. Attack! Let me at 'em. Right. Attack! Say the word. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Let me at 'em. Dwarves! Let me at 'em. On my way. Attack! Dwarf! Aye, my lord. Right.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
On my way. Attack!
Our allies'
Let me
hero
at 'em.
has fallen.
Dwarf! Let me at 'em. To arms!
Our allied hero has fallen.
Let me at 'em! Attack! To arms! To arms! Aye, my lord. Of course. Attack! Let me
That's
at 'em!
these, Matt.
Let me at 'em!
That's these
Attack!
nuts.
To arms! On my way. Right. To arms! Let me at 'em! Attack! To arms! Let me at 'em! Attack! Here's my to arms! Let me at 'em! Attack! Let me at 'em!
Our allies
Aye,
hero
my
has
lord.
fallen.
Of course. To arms! Right. Attack! To arms! On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Let me at 'em! Attack!
Our allied hero has fallen.
To arms! Let me at 'em! Attack! To arms! Attack!
Upgrade complete.
On my way. Of course. Right. Let me at 'em! Attack! To arms! Let me at 'em! Orders? Let me at 'em! To arms! Say the word. Attack! Attack! Orders? Aye, my lord. Let me at 'em! Of course. Right. To arms!
Ready to work.
To arms! On my way.
Our hero has fallen. Ready to work.
Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Right. What do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Orders? Of course. Aye, my lord. What do you need? On my way. Say the word. What do you need? Orders? Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Orders? Aye, my lord. On my way. What do you need? Say the word. Right. Of course. On my way. Orders? Right. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Of course. Of course. What do you need? Aye, my lord. On my way. Attack! Right. Of course. What do you need? Orders? Right. Say the word. On my way. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. Aye, my lord. Let me at 'em. Say the word. Attack! On my way. Let me at 'em. Right. Right. Orders? Of course. What do you need? Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. On my way. Orders? Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. To arms! Let me at 'em. To arms!
Our forces are under attack.
Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Say the word. Of course. On my way. What do you need? Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Attack! Orders. Attack! Yes, my liege. Say the word. To arms! What do you need? Aye, my lord. Right. What do you need? On my way. Let me out. Right. Yes, my liege. Say the word. On my way. Let me out. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. To arms! Attack! On my way. Orders. To arms! Right. Attack! Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Let me out. What do you need? Right. Of course. Say the word. What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Yes, my liege. Say the word. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Orders?
Ready to work.
Say the word. What do you need? Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. Say the word. On my way. Orders? Yes, my liege. Of course. Aye, my lord. Orders? To arms! What do you need? Let me at 'em. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Attack! Right. Attack! On my way. To arms! Yes, my liege. Of course. Let me at 'em. Orders? Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word.
Our
Yes, my
allies'
liege.
hero has
Of course. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. Right. Of course. On my way. Say the word. Aye, my lord. What do you need? On my way.
Our forces are under attack.
Yes, my liege. Say the word. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Orders? Attack! Say the word. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. On my way. Orders? Yes, my liege. Orders? Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. What do you need? Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. On my way. Orders. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Yes, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Say the word. What do you need? Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Let me out. Yes, my liege. What do you need?
Research.
Aye, my lord. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. Let me at 'em. To arms! Of course. Attack! Aye, my lord. Orders? Let me at 'em. On my way. Orders? What do you need? To arms! Say the word. Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. Of course. Attack! To arms! Attack! Let me at 'em. Attack! To arms! Let me at 'em! Let me at 'em! To arms! Attack! To arms! Let me at 'em! Attack! Attack! To arms! Let me at 'em! To arms! Attack! On my way! Let me at 'em! To arms! Attack! Right. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Let me out. Right. On my way. For Lordaeron! Attack!
Our hero has fallen. Our allies' hero has fallen.
Aye, my lord. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right.
Our allies' hero
Of
has
course.
fallen.
Orders? Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Right. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. What do you need? Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Of course. Orders? Orders? On my way. Right. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word.
Our forces are under attack.
Yes, my liege. Say the word. Right. Orders? What do you need? On my way.
Allies' hero has fallen.
Yes, my liege. What do you need? Say the word. Aye, my lord. Right. Let me at him. Yes, my liege. To arms! Orders? Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way.
Our forces
Say
are
the
under
word.
attack.
Attack! Of course. What do you need? On my way. Orders? Yes, my liege. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Right. Let me at him. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Of course. To arms! Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders? Say the word. Yes, my lord.
Research.
Say the word. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. To arms!
Not enough.
Let me at him. For Lordaeron! Attack!
Our hero has fallen.
On my way. Of course. Right. What do you need? Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Yes, my liege. Right. What do you need? Of course. Say the word. Right. Attack! Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Orders? On my way. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? To arms! Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Let me at him. Of course. Aye, my lord. Yes, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Say the word. Of course. Say the word. Orders? Of course. On my way. On my way. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Let me at 'em. Of course. On my way. Attack! Dwarf! Let me at 'em. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders? Say the word. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Yes, my liege. What do you need? Attack!
Not
Dwarf!
enough now.
Right. Attack! Let me at 'em. Dwarf! Of course. On my way. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. Attack! Orders? What do you need? On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Let me at 'em. Aye, my lord. Dwarves! Of course. What do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Let me at 'em. Aye, my lord. Attack! Right. Of course. On my way. Orders? On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course.
Inventory is full.
Right. Say the word. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Say the word. Orders? What do you need? Yes, my liege. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. What do you need? On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Dwarf! Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Dwarves! Attack! Let me at 'em. Attack! Dwarves! Let me at 'em. Dwarves!
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Right. Aye, my lord. Attack! Let me at 'em. Let me at 'em. Dwarf! Attack! Of course. Attack! Let me at 'em! To arms! Attack! On my way! Of course. Say the word. To arms! Let me at 'em! On my way! To arms! Yes, my liege. Right. Let me at 'em! Aye, my lord. Attack! To arms! Aye, my lord. Let me at 'em! Attack! Orders, orders, say the word. What do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. Right.
What you be craving?
What do you need? Aye, my lord.
You seek me help?
Say the word.
I hear the summons. Right away.
Yes, my liege. Of course.
How may I serve?
Orders?
What you be craving?
Say the word. Yes, my liege. Orders? On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Right. Orders? Of course.
Research
Aye,
complete.
my lord. Say the word.
Our allies' hero has
What
fallen.
do you need? Right. On my way. Of course. On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. What do you need? Say the word. On my way. Aye, my lord. Orders. To arms! Let me at 'em! Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. Of course. Yes, my liege. Right.
Research
You need.
complete.
On my way. Orders? Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Say the word. You need. Orders? Of course. Of course. Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Say the word. What do you need? Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Orders? Say the word. Attack! On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. What do you need? Right. To arms! Of course. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders? do you need? Say the word. On my way. Right. Right. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. You need? Right. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course.
Our allies hero
On
has
my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders. On my way. Attack! What do you need? Right. Right. Let me at 'em. To arms! Yes, my liege. On my way. Of course. Orders. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Say the word. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Orders. On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Let me at it. Say the word. Attack! Right.
allies hero has
On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege.
Our
you
allies
need?
hero has fallen.
Orders? Right. Say the word. On my way. Orders? To arms! Let me at 'em. Yes, my liege. You need? Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. What do you need? Right. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Attack! Whoa! Right. On my way. Of course.
Our hero has fallen.
Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right.
Our
Say the
allies
word.
hero
Of
has
course.
fallen.
On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Orders? On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. Right. On my way. What do you need? Say the word. On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Of course. Orders? Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. Let me at 'em. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Attack! Of course. Say the word. You need? Aye, my lord. On my way. Yes, my liege. Right.
Help me, help you.
Orders? Of course.
This better be good.
Say the word. On my way. What do you need? Right. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Orders? Aye, my lord. What do you need? Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Yes, my liege. Say the word. On my way. What do you need? Orders? Orders? Yes, my liege. Of course. You need? Aye. For Lordaeron! Aye. Whoa! Right. Let me go. On my way.
Our hero has fallen.
Say the word. Orders. On my way. Right. Of course. Say the word. You need. Aye. Right. Yes, my liege. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course.
Allies, hero
You
has
need.
fallen.
On my way. I'll be going. Contact! Aye. Let me have it. Right. Whoa! On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Right. Of course. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Orders. On my way. Of course. Yes, my liege. Aye. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. You need? Of course. Say the word. You need? Right. Orders. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. my liege. Say the word. You need. Attack!
Our forces are under attack. Our allied hero has fallen.
Of course. You need. On my way. Here's my liege. I'll go right. Here's my liege. Right. On my way. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Right. What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders. On my way. On my way. Yes, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. Right. Say the word. Aye, my lord. On my way. What do you need? On my way. What do you need? Aye. Yes, my lord. Aye. Say the word. On my way. You need. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. Say the word. Orders. Attack! Let me out. Sword! Right. Attack! Aye, my lord. On my way. Let me out. You need. Yes, my liege. Sword! Let me out. Orders. Attack! Say the word. Sword! Right. Let me out. You need. Yes, my liege. Yes, my liege. Dwarf! Say the word. What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. Of course. Attack! Attack! Dwarf! On my way. Let me out. Attack! Let me out. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Attack! Aye, my lord. To arms! On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Yes, my liege. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. Say the word. Of course. Say the word. On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Say the word. What do you need? Orders? Yes, my liege.
What is it?
Say the word. Aye, my lord. Of course.
More word?
Orders? On my way.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Yes, my liege. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Yes, my liege. What do you need? Orders? Let me at 'em. Say the word. Attack! Orders? Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my
Our
lord.
allies' hero has fallen.
Right. What do you need? Say the word. On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. Say the word. Right. Let me at 'em. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Of course.
Our forces are under attack.
On my way. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. On my way. Right. What do you need? Say the word. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord.
Inventory is full.
Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Right. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. What do you need? Right. Orders? On my way! Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Say the word.
Build more farms.
Say the word. Orders? On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Attack! On my way. Cool. Aye, my lord. Right. Oh, Lord of God! Aye, my lord. Course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Attack! Let me at him.
Our hero has fallen.
Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. You need. Orders? Say the word. Orders? Yes, my liege. You need. Say the word. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way.
Hero has
On my way.
Hero has
Right. Aye, my lord. Of course.
Our hero has fallen. Our allies' hero has fallen.
Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. What do you need? Say the word. Aye, my lord. On my way. Yes, my liege. Orders? Right. Of course. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. On my way. You need? Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Let me at him. For Lord! Right. Say the word. Right.
Allies' hero has
Course.
fallen.
What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord.
Our hero has fallen. Our allies' hero has
Orders?
fallen.
Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Right. Attack! Let me at him. Attack! On my way. You need?
Not enough.
On my way. Attack!
Not enough. Our hero has fallen.
Right. Of course.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Say the word. Aye, my lord. Right. Let me at him. On my way. On my way.
Allies' hero has fallen.
Right. Let me at him. To arms!
allied hero has fallen.
Let me at him. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Right. Of course. On my way. Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Of course. Right. Say the word. Orders. What do you need? Yes, my liege. On my way. Orders. Aye, my lord. Of course. Attack! For Lordaeron! Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. Right. What do you need? What do you need? Of course. Orders. Say the word. Right. Of course. Yes, my liege. On my way. Yes, my liege. Orders. What do you need? Say the word. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Orders. Of course. Say the word. What do you need? Right. What do you need? On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord.
Our forces are under attack.
On my way. Yes, my lord. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Say the word. You need.
Our forces are under attack.
Say the word. Orders. You need. Yes, my liege. Orders. Right. Say the word.
Are under attack.
Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Let me at him. To arms! Attack! Let me at him. Attack! To arms! Attack! To arms! What do you need? Right. Let me at him. Aye, my lord. To arms! On my way. Attack! Of course. Yes, my liege. Orders. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Let me out. Of course. Let me out. Right. Aye, my lord. Attack! Of course. Yes, my liege. Say the word. What do you need? Say the word.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
What do you need? Orders. Yes, my liege.
Our allies'
On
hero
my way.
has fallen.
Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Say the word. Orders? Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Orders? Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. To arms! Let me out! Attack! On my way. To arms! To arms! Right. Here's my lead. Right. Let me out! On my way. For Lordaeron! Attack! Let me out! Aye, my lord. Attack! Of course. To arms! To arms! Aye, my lord. Right. Let me at him.
Our hero has fallen.
Say the word. On my way. What do you need? Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Orders?
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Yes, my lord. What do you need? What do you need? Say the word. Yes, my lord. On my way.
Our allies' hero
Aye,
has
my
fallen.
lord. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Attack! Of course.
Inventory is
On
full.
my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. For Lordaeron!
Our hero has fallen.
Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Orders? Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders? Yes, my liege. Say the word. Right. What do you need? On my way. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course.
Our
Aye, my
allies'
lord.
hero has fallen.
Say the word. On my way. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. What do you need? Right. Right. Aye,
Our
my lord.
allies'
Of
hero
course.
has fallen.
On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Say the word. Of course. Right.
Allies' hero has fallen.
What do you need?
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Of
Our
course.
allies' hero has fallen.
Right. What do you need? Orders? Say the word. Yes, my liege.
Allies' hero has
Let
fallen.
me out. On my way. On my way.
Allies'
Attack! Aye, my lord. What do you need? To arms! Yes, my liege. Let me out. Say the word.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
To arms! Attack! Orders? What do you need? Right. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Right. Orders? Say the word. What do you need? Say the word. Of course. What do you need? On my way. On my way. Right. Attack! Of course. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Here's my... On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Let me out. Dwarf! Dwarf! Let me at him. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord.
Our hero has fallen.
On my way. Orders? Right. Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Right. Orders? Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Say the word. On my way. Yes, my liege. Attack! Dwarf! Let me out! Order. On my way. On my way. Say the word. Attack! Say the word. Attack! For Lordaeron! Dwarf! Let me out! Dwarf! Attack! Let me out! Dwarf! For Lordaeron! Right. Attack! Dwarf! On my way! Attack! On my way! Dwarf!
Allies' hero has fallen. Our allies' hero has fallen.
Right.
Our forces are under attack. Has fallen.
Of course. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Say the word. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. On my way. Right. What do you need? Right. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Yes, my liege. Say the word.
Our forces are under
You
attack.
need? Of course. Let me at him. Right. Attack! Attack! Yes. Aye, my lord. Of course. Dwarf! On my way.
Not enough.
Yes, my liege. For Lordaeron! You need? Of course. On my way. Say the word. Orders? Aye, my lord. Right. What do you need? Say the word. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Let me at him. Let me at him. Yes, my liege. What do you need? On my way. Dwarf! Orders? Right. Attack! Let me out! Say the word. To arms! Attack! On my way. What do you need? Yes, right. Say the word. On my way. Orders. Orders. Right. On my way. Say the word. Let me out. It is. To arms! To arms! Yes, my lord. Our allied hero has fallen. Let me out. Attack!
Our forces are under attack.
It is. To arms! Say the word. Let me out.
Not enough now.
Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. On my way. You need? Right. Orders. On my way.
Research complete. Our allied hero has fallen.
Of course. What do you need? Yes, say the word. Attack! Aye, my lord. For the order on! Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Attack! Let me at 'em. Right. To arms! On my way. Aye, my lord. Attack! Aye, my lord. Right. What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord. To arms! On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Orders? Yes, my liege. Of course. Say the word. Right. Orders? On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. What do you need? What do you need? Yes, my liege. Orders? Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Say the word. On my way. You need? Right. Right. Aye. Of course. Orders? On my way.
Forces are under attack.
Right. On my way. Let me out. Oh, order on. I will. Let me out. To arms. I will. Attack. Attack. To arms. Yes. Let me out. way. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Say the word. Of course. Orders? Orders? Attack! On my way. Aye, my lord. Let me go. You need? Right. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Oh. On my way.
Yes, forces are under attack.
Whoa! Attack! Say the word. Let me out. Orders. Say the word. Here's my lead. Whoa! Attack! You need. Let me out. Orders. What do you need? Whoa! Say the word. Whoa! I'm in order.
Our hero has fallen.
Yes, my liege. Right. Say the word. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Orders? On my way. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. Right.
Our forces are under attack.
What do you need? Of course. Attack! Orders? Say the word. What do you need? Let me at him! Let me at him! Orders? Here's my lead. Say the word. To arms!
Our hero has fallen.
Say the word. Right. On my way. Right. Orders? On my way. Of course. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Of course.
Our forces are under
Aye,
attack.
my lord. Attack! To arms! Yes, my lord. Attack! Orders. Let me out. Right. What do you need? On my way.
Our forces are under attack.
For Lord to arms! Order. Say the word. Yes, my lord. I'm in order. What do you need? Orders? Say the word. Yes, my liege. What do you need? What do you need? Of course. Orders? Yes, my liege.
Our forces are under
Say the
attack.
word. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Orders? Attack! You need.
Not
Let
enough.
me out. Say the word.
Our forces are under attack. Our hero has fallen.
Of course. On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right.
Inventory is full.
Let me out. On my way. What do you need? What do you need? Aye, my lord. Orders. Say the word. Attack! Yes, my liege. Say the word. Right. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. To arms! Attack! On my way. To arms! For Lordaeron! Of course. Of course. Yes, my liege. Orders. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right.
Inventory is full.
Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Let me out. You need. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course.
Our allies'
On my
hero
way.
has fallen.
Right. To arms! What do you need? Aye, my lord. Attack! Orders. Say the word. Yes, my liege.
Our hero has fallen.
Aye, my lord. What do you need? Right. On my way. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. Yes, my liege.
More knowledge is required.
Say the word. Aye, my lord. Orders. Right. What do you need? Say the word. Yes, my liege. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the
Forces
word.
are under attack.
On my way. Of course. On my way. Orders. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. Orders. What do you need? Let me out. Right. On my way.
Our hero has fallen.
Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. Of course. Right. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Orders? Right. What do you need? Orders? On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. Say the word. On my way. What do you need? Say the word. Yes, my liege. Orders? Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Let me at him. Attack! Right. For Lordaeron! Dwarf! Aye, right. On my way. Attack! Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. To arms! On my way. Let me at him. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. Right. Let me at him. On my way. Attack! To arms! Let me at him.
Our hero has fallen.
Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders? Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. On my way. What do you need?
Our
Aye, my
allies'
lord.
hero has fallen.
Right. Of course. On my way. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. Say the word. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. For Lordaeron! Dwarf!
Our hero has fallen.
Right. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
What do you need? Of course. Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. Say the word. What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Attack! Orders? You need? Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. Yes, my liege. Orders? On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Let me at him. Say the word. Of course. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Attack! To arms! Let me at him. To arms! Attack! To arms! Yes, my lord. Say
hero
Let
has
me out.
fallen. Our hero has fallen.
Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord.
Our forces are under attack. Our allied hero has fallen.
Orders.
Our forces are under attack.